Welcome back, or perhaps this is your first time here. Either way, you are welcome. You have settled somewhere comfortable. Your body is beginning to release the tension it has been carrying. The day, with all its demands, is growing quieter around you. Tonight, we are going to talk about rules, but not the rules you are used to thinking about, not the rules that feel arbitrary and frustrating. Not the rules that you follow because someone told you to without ever quite understanding why. Tonight, we are going to talk about rules that were, in their time, brilliant. Rules that solved real problems. Rules that kept people alive, kept societies functioning, kept order in a world that had very few of the tools we rely on today. Rules that looked strange, looked absolutely bizarre, in some cases, if you did not know the problem they were solving, and most of the time, the people following them did not know the problem either. That is one of the most interesting things about medieval rules. The knowledge of why a rule existed often separated from the rule itself after only a generation or two. The children of the people who invented a rule simply followed it because their parents had. Their grandchildren followed it because it was tradition. By the time we look back at it across several centuries, it appears as nothing but an oddity, a quirk, a strange habit of a strange time. But the original reason is still there, still legible if you look carefully. Tonight we are going to look carefully. We will explore 4 areas. The rules of dress. What you wore in medieval Europe was not merely a fashion choice. It was legally controlled, socially enforced, and practically important in ways that are not immediately obvious to us now. The rules of the table. How food was served, in what order, by whom, in what vessels, with what rituals. Each detail carried a specific function that went far beyond politeness. The laws of survival. Certain medieval laws that appear strange or oppressive were in fact sophisticated responses to the specific dangers of medieval urban and rural life. And finally, the logic built into stone. Medieval buildings, castles, churches, market halls were designed according to rules that are invisible until you know what you are looking at, and then they reveal a world of embedded practical intelligence. There is no hurry tonight. Each section will open slowly. Each explanation will have space, and between the ideas, there will be quiet. Let us begin with the clothes on your back, or rather, the clothes you were not allowed to wear. In medieval Europe, what you wore was not a personal choice in the way we understand personal choice today. It was regulated by law. The regulations were called sumptuary laws, from the Latin sumptus, meaning expense or cost. Sumptuary laws were legal codes that specified what different classes of people were and were not permitted to wear. What fabrics, what colors, what furs, what styles, what lengths and shapes and decorative elements. These laws existed across most of medieval Europe. They were issued by kings, by city councils, by the church. They were revised repeatedly, sometimes tightened, sometimes relaxed, sometimes entirely replaced by new versions. And to a modern eye, they look like pure snobbery, the powerful telling the less powerful what they are not allowed to wear. An attempt to force visible social difference by controlling appearances. That reading is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete, because sumptuary laws were also solving a problem that was genuinely serious in medieval society, a problem that is invisible to us now because we solved it in a different way. The problem was identification. In medieval Europe, legal status determined almost everything: what taxes you owed, what courts you could be tried in, what punishments could be applied to you, what oaths you were permitted to take, whether you could carry weapons, whether you could own land, what guild you could join, what trade you were permitted to practice. Legal status was not a theoretical abstraction. It was the framework through which every transaction, every dispute, every obligation in medieval life was processed. And in a world without photographs, without identity documents as we understand them, without the kind of standardized record keeping we now take for granted, legal status had to be visible. It had to be readable at a glance by anyone in any market square or courtroom or church. Clothing was the primary way this happened. A person's clothing announced their status. And for this announcement to function reliably, for a judge to be able to look at a person standing before him and immediately understand what legal category they fell into, the signals had to be consistent, unambiguous, enforced. If a poor craftsman could dress exactly like a wealthy merchant, the signals collapsed. The system of visible status became unreadable. Sumptuary laws, from this perspective, were a classification system, a way of keeping the visual language of status legible in a society that depended on it. Let us look at some specific examples, because the details are where the logic becomes most visible. Color was one of the most important status signals in medieval clothing. Certain colors were simply more expensive than others, because the dyes required to produce them were rare and difficult to obtain. Purple, for example, particularly the deep, brilliant purple produced from the murex sea snail of the Mediterranean, was extraordinarily expensive. It required an enormous number of mollusks to produce a small quantity of dye. The resulting color was vivid in a way that could not be matched by plant-based dyes available elsewhere. Purple had been the color of Roman imperial power for centuries before the medieval period began. Medieval European royalty inherited this association, and sumptuary laws formalized it, reserving purple and its near relatives for the highest ranks. Scarlet red, produced from the Kermes insect found on certain oak trees in the Mediterranean region, was similarly expensive and similarly controlled. The deeper and more vivid the red, the more costly the dye, and the more restricted its use. When you see medieval paintings or illuminated manuscripts showing kings and high nobility in deep, saturated colors, and lower status figures in muted browns and grays and undyed wools, you are not looking at artistic convention. You are looking at an accurate visual record of how color functioned as a status marker. And you are looking at the reason sumptuary laws existed, to keep those colors where they were, attached to the status they signaled. Now let us talk about an example that seems, on its surface, entirely absurd. The pointed shoe. If you have ever looked at images of medieval footwear, particularly from the 14th and 15th centuries, you have likely noticed the shoes. Long, impractically long, sometimes curling upward at the toe, sometimes so extended that the tip had to be tied to the ankle with a cord to prevent it from flopping. These are called poulaines, and in some portraits, the toes extend several inches, even approaching a foot, beyond the end of the actual foot. Why would anyone wear this? The answer begins not with fashion, but with function, and then proceeds through the social logic of sumptuary law in a way that reveals exactly how these systems worked. The poulain originated in areas of Europe where road conditions were poor and floors were frequently covered with rushes, straw, or other plant material that was replaced only periodically. In these conditions, a somewhat elongated toe kept the foot elevated from the worst of the floor debris. The shoe's length meant the tip touched the ground first, keeping the back of the shoe and the heel relatively clean. This was a modest functional advantage. But then, the status logic of medieval clothing took hold, and the modest advantage became an extravagant signal. Here is the mechanism. A longer-toed shoe is more expensive to make than a shorter one. It requires more leather, more skilled construction to keep the extended toe in shape, and more frequent repair, because the extended portion was vulnerable to damage. Only wealthy people could afford the most extended versions, and wealthy people in medieval society did not perform manual labor. Their feet were not their primary tools. They did not need to run, to climb, to work fields. They could afford footwear that was functionally impractical. The impossibly long toe was not therefore a sign of foolishness. It was a sign of wealth so complete that impractical shoes were no obstacle. It was a signal of status embedded in the willingness to be impractical. Sumptuary laws regulated the length of shoe points by social rank. Records from late 14th century France and England specify maximum toe lengths for different social classes. A common person might wear a toe extension of a few finger widths, a knight more, a lord more still, a prince or duke no limit. This was not arbitrary. It was a visual hierarchy, written in leather, legible to anyone who knew the code. The laws were not always followed. The sumptuary laws of medieval Europe were frequently violated, and this is documented extensively in the records of their repeated reissuance. If a law is issued once and sufficient, it does not need to be issued again. The fact that sumptuary laws were repeatedly updated, strengthened, and reissued across the medieval period tells us clearly that people were violating them constantly. Prosperous merchants wore colors and furs reserved for nobility. Urban craftsmen wore better cloth than their legal status permitted. People wanted to present themselves as higher than their legal position, and they did so by wearing the signals of higher positions. This social climbing through clothing irritated the nobility enormously, because if their visual signals were being copied, their status was being visually eroded, and so the laws were tightened and violated again. The entire cycle is a very human story about the gap between the official order and the actual behavior of people who found the official order inconvenient. Fur was another regulated material. Different furs signaled different ranks with remarkable precision. Ermine, the white winter fur of the stoat, with its characteristic black tail tips, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. You can still see it on ceremonial robes in many European countries today. It was not merely decorative, it was a language. Miniver, a fine pale fur from a specific type of squirrel, was used for nobles of somewhat lower rank. Fox, rabbit, lamb, each species of fur occupied a position in the hierarchy, and wearing the wrong fur was not merely a social error, It was, in many jurisdictions, a legal offense. The reason fur was so well suited to this function was that its quality and rarity were apparent to any skilled observer. You could not easily fake ermine with cheaper material. The particular pattern of white, with black tip markings, was distinctive. A fraud would be visible. The rules of dress in medieval Europe were therefore not merely snobbery. They were a classification system, a status communication network, and a set of legal boundaries, all encoded in what people wore on their bodies. They were, in their time, a form of information management. Now let us go inside, into the Great Hall, where the food is being laid out, where the guests are taking their places, where one of the most carefully orchestrated safety systems in medieval life is about to unfold. The medieval feast. What we are going to describe is not the fantasy version, not the opulent celebration of popular imagination, but the actual, working reality of a formal medieval dinner in a castle or great household, a setting in which every detail of the meal, the food, the vessels, the serving order, the ritual objects, the people who touched the food, was governed by rules that existed for a specific reason. That reason was primarily safety. In a medieval great household, poison was a genuine concern. This is not medieval paranoia or superstition. Historical records from across medieval Europe, court records, political chronicles, letters, legal documents, contain extensive evidence of deliberate poisoning as a method of eliminating enemies and inconvenient people. The risk was real, it was taken seriously, and the rituals of the medieval table were, in large part, designed to manage it. The food taster is perhaps the most famous element of this system. Every person of significant importance in medieval Europe employed food tasters. The taster was a member of the household whose specific role was to consume a portion of every dish and every drink before it was served to the lord or noble. The logic is straightforward. If the food is poisoned, the taster falls ill or dies before the lord is harmed. The lord is warned. The lord survives. This sounds brutal to modern sensibilities, and it was, from the taster's perspective, a role that carried significant personal risk. But food tasters were not selected from the most vulnerable members of the household. They were, in many cases, relatively senior and trusted individuals, people who were knowledgeable about food preparation, people who could also assess quality, freshness, and proper preparation, not only safety. The role combined quality control with safety monitoring. The food taster's function was sufficiently important that it was regulated in royal and noble households across medieval Europe. In the English royal household, the position had a formal title and a defined place in the household hierarchy. Records from the households of French, Spanish, and Italian nobles show similar positions with similar functions. The ritual of tasting was public and visible. It was performed at table in view of the assembled household and guests. This visibility was deliberate. It was not enough that the food was safe. It had to be demonstrably safe. The guests needed to see the process. The public performance of the tasting transformed a safety measure into a social reassurance. Now let us talk about the salt cellar. We touched on salt in our last conversation, but here we go deeper into the specific security logic of salt in the medieval feast. Salt, as we noted, was economically valuable, but at the formal table, it also played a specific role in the ritual of safety. Salt was one of the primary methods available to medieval society for detecting certain types of poison. Specifically, silver-mounted salt cellars were common in wealthy households because silver, which medieval metallurgical knowledge associated with purity, was believed to tarnish or change color in the presence of certain harmful substances. This belief was partially founded. Some silver alloys do react with certain compounds. Whether the silver of a medieval salt cellar would reliably detect the specific poisons most commonly used is uncertain by modern chemical standards, but the belief was genuine and the practice was standard. A lord's salt cellar was positioned prominently at the table. It was guarded, literally, in some households, watched over by a designated individual during the meal. It was treated as a precious and significant object. Its location at the table established the hierarchy we mentioned, those above the salt seated nearest the lord, those below the salt in the lower ranking seats. But the salt cellar was also the centerpiece of an anti-poisoning system. The salt was tasted by the taster. The serving vessels were tested. The proximity of the cellar to the Lord's portion meant it could be used to test any dish placed near him. The entire ritual of the formal medieval feast was, at one level, a theatrical performance of safety. A demonstration, visible to everyone present, that the food was being tested, verified, and controlled at every stage. The trencher is another element of the medieval table that carries hidden logic. Before plates as we use them were standard, medieval diners at formal meals ate off thick slabs of slightly stale bread called trenchers. The bread served as an edible plate. It absorbed the juices and sauces from the food placed on it. At the end of the meal, the trencher, now thoroughly saturated with the meal's residue, was distributed to the poor waiting outside. This was understood as an act of charity. The Lord fed not only his guests, but those who waited for what remained. But the trencher also served a practical function. Using bread as a plate meant that the surfaces in contact with food could be disposed of entirely after the meal. Unlike a ceramic or wooden plate, a trencher did not need to be washed and reused. It could not carry residual contamination from a previous meal. It was, in a sense, entirely disposable. For a household concerned with food safety, this was not a trivial consideration. The question of who prepared the food and who served it was equally carefully governed in great households. The kitchen was a place of significant security concern. Access to the kitchen, to the food being prepared for the Lord's table, was controlled. The kitchen staff were known individuals, usually long-serving members of the household, whose backgrounds were understood and whose loyalty was presumed. Unknown persons were not admitted to the kitchen. Suppliers who delivered raw ingredients did not enter the kitchen. They delivered to a designated receiving area where the goods were inspected. The supply chain for the Lord's food was kept as short and as controlled as possible, precisely because each additional step in the chain was an additional point of vulnerability. This logic is now embedded in modern food safety practices, though the original concern was deliberate contamination rather than accidental contamination. The principle, control the chain, minimize unknown contacts, verify at each stage, is identical. The serving hierarchy was also carefully structured. Dishes were not carried from the kitchen to the table by random members of the household. In a great house, The serving of food was managed by the steward and a set of known, trusted servers. Each dish had a designated path from the kitchen to the table through hands that were known and supervised. This structure was not about creating an impressive display of household organization, though it accomplished that too. It was about maintaining an unbroken chain of custody over the food from preparation to consumption. Medieval food rituals were, in short, a complete security system, a system designed by people who understood that their food supply was vulnerable, who knew the potential consequences of that vulnerability, and who had devised practical, observable, maintainable procedures for managing it, expressed in the language and resources available to them, which were bread plates and silver salt cellars and trusted tasters and formal processions of servers, not so different in their underlying logic from modern food safety protocols, even if the specific mechanisms bear no resemblance. The laws. Let us talk now about 3 specific medieval laws that appear strange and even punitive to modern eyes, but which were, in their original context, functional solutions to specific social problems. The first is the curfew. The word curfew is so common in modern English, we use it for the rules parents set about when their children must be home, for emergency restrictions on movement, that its origin has become completely invisible. Curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. In medieval towns and cities, the risk of fire was catastrophic. We discussed this briefly in our last conversation, but here we go into the specific law that responded to it. Medieval buildings were constructed primarily from wood. They were densely packed together along narrow streets. They had open hearths, not enclosed fireplaces with adequate chimneys, but open fires in the center or against a wall of a room, feeding smoke upward through a hole in the roof or a rudimentary chimney. These fires were necessary. They were the only source of heat, the only means of cooking. In winter, extinguishing them entirely was not an option. But a fire left untended overnight in a wooden building in a densely packed wooden town was a disaster waiting to happen. The solution was the curfew bell. At a designated hour in the evening, varying by town and by season, but typically around 8 or 9 at night, the town bell was rung. This signal meant, cover your fire, bank it down, cover the embers with ash, reduce it to the minimum needed to maintain the coals for relighting in the morning. It was not an instruction to extinguish the fire entirely. It was an instruction to reduce it to its safest possible state before the household went to sleep. The bell also served as a signal for the general reduction of outdoor activity. People on the streets after the curfew bell were unusual. They attracted attention. The night watch, which most medieval towns of any size maintained, had authority to question or detain people found abroad after curfew. This secondary function, reducing nighttime movement, did serve to limit opportunities for certain kinds of crime that were easier to commit under the cover of darkness. But this was a consequence of the curfew's primary fire safety purpose, not its original intent. The curfew bell as a fire management tool was so effective that it persisted in many European towns for centuries. The physical evidence is still visible. The bell towers of many medieval churches in England, France, and the Low Countries still stand, and in some cases, the bells that once rung the nightly curfew are still in their towers. The word survived the practice. We still use curfew. We simply forget that we are saying, cover the fire. The second law is the assize of bread. In 1266, the English crown issued a law that regulated the price and weight of bread in relation to the current price of grain. Specifically, when grain prices were high, the allowed price of bread rose, and when grain prices fell, the price of bread fell with it. But critically, the weight and quality standards for bread were fixed. A baker who sold underweight bread, or bread adulterated with cheaper ingredients, faced a graduated series of punishments. This sounds like ordinary consumer protection, and in a modern sense it is, but in medieval England it was something much more specific and much more urgent. Bread was not a dietary preference in medieval England. It was the primary caloric source for the majority of the population. Not one food among many, but the central food, the one without which survival through winter and lean seasons was not guaranteed. The baking profession was therefore not simply a trade, it was, from the perspective of the crown and local authorities, an essential public service on which the physical survival of the population depended. A dishonest baker was not merely a fraud. He was a person whose dishonesty could directly contribute to malnutrition and starvation among people who had no alternative. The assize of bread was a law designed to make that specific fraud both detectable and punishable. By specifying weight and quality standards in law, the Crown gave consumers a legal recourse and gave inspectors a measurable standard against which to test the goods being sold. The medieval marketplace had inspectors, officers whose role included the physical testing of goods, weights and measures officials who carried standard weights and measures with them for comparison. These were not casual or occasional inspections. In towns with active markets and large populations, they were regular and systematic. The bakers of medieval England, operating under the assize of bread, were among the most regulated tradespeople in the country, and the reason for that regulation was entirely proportionate to the importance of what they sold. The custom of the baker's dozen, 13 items rather than 12, likely grew directly from the assize's penalty system. A baker found selling underweight loaves could face significant punishment. By adding a 13th loaf to each dozen sold, bakers ensured that even if individual loaves varied slightly in weight, the total weight of the batch would reliably meet the legal standard. The extra loaf was insurance against the inspector's scale, a small, practical solution to a specific legal risk, so consistent, so widespread, that it became a permanent custom. The third law is the Frank Pledge system. This one requires a moment to set up, because it is less familiar than the curfew or the bread laws. In medieval England, and in variant forms across much of northern Europe, local communities were organized into groups of approximately 10 to 12 households, called tithings. Every male above a certain age within a tithing was enrolled in the Frank Pledge. The principle of the Frank Pledge was collective responsibility. If a member of a tithing committed a crime and could not be produced for justice, if they fled, if they disappeared, the other members of the tithing were financially responsible for the penalty. They paid collectively for the failure of one of their number to face justice. This seems to a modern eye like collective punishment, which is, in many contexts, considered unjust. But let us look at what problem it was solving. Medieval England had no police force in any modern sense. It had no detective capacity. It had no forensic science, no reliable identification methods, no system for tracking individuals as they moved between communities. When a crime was committed and the criminal fled, the ability of any authority to find them was extremely limited. Travel between communities was relatively easy. A person could be unknown in a new location within a day's walk from their home. The Frank Pledge system solved this by making disappearance economically costly to the disappearing person's community. If a member of your tithing commits a crime and runs, you pay. Every member of the group pays. This gave every member of every tithing a very strong personal interest in monitoring the behavior of the other members, in knowing where they were, in knowing what they were doing, and having some ability to influence their behavior before a crime was committed or to produce them for justice after one was committed. The Frank Pledge created a distributed surveillance and accountability system using existing social bonds, neighborhood, community, economic interest, rather than requiring any central enforcement capacity. The community became its own monitor. Was it fair? Not entirely. A person could be penalized for the actions of a neighbor they had little ability to control. The system was blunter than modern judicial concepts of individual responsibility would allow. But it worked, in its specific historical context, as a mechanism for maintaining a form of accountability in communities where the alternatives were simply no accountability at all. It was a law designed not for an ideal world, but for the world that actually existed. The medieval world frequently did this. It devised solutions that were imperfect, but that were calibrated to the actual available resources and capacities of the time and place. Let us go now to the buildings, because some of the most interesting medieval logic is embedded in stone. If you have ever visited a medieval castle or seen photographs or films of one, you may have noticed that the interior staircases spiral. They turn as they rise. Most of them turn in the same direction. Clockwise, when you stand at the bottom of a medieval spiral staircase and look up, the steps curve away to the right. This is not decorative. It is not a convention chosen for aesthetic reasons. It is a deliberate engineering decision made on the basis of combat. In a castle under attack, the attackers move upward. They climb from the ground floor to the upper floors, pressing through whatever resistance the defenders can offer. In a spiral staircase that turns clockwise as it rises, an attacker climbing upward faces the wall to his right. The right hand is, for most people, the sword hand, the weapon hand, the active hand. A right-handed attacker climbing a clockwise spiral staircase has his sword arm pressed toward the central pillar. The outer wall is on his left. His sword can swing freely to his left, but is obstructed in its sweep to the right by the pillar. A right-handed defender, descending to meet the attacker, has the opposite geometry. His sword arm is on the outer side of the staircase. He has full freedom of swing to his right, which is where the attacker below him is positioned. The spiral staircase, turning clockwise, gave a systematic combat advantage to the defenders. Every castle that built clockwise staircases was embedding a tactical advantage directly into its architecture. This detail appears in military history texts, including works on medieval castle design such as those assembled by historians of fortification like John Goodall. It is not a modern reconstruction or a romantic reading of the evidence. Contemporary military writers of the medieval period understood this advantage explicitly. There is a famous exception that proves the rule. Ferniehirst Castle in Scotland, historically home to the Kerr family, has spiral staircases that turn counterclockwise to the left. The Kerr family had an unusual prevalence of left-handedness across several generations, documented in contemporary accounts, and so their castle's staircases were built to favor left-handed defenders. The architectural anomaly was a deliberate engineering choice made to match the specific physical characteristics of the people who would be defending the building. The small window. Medieval windows in castles and most stone buildings were small, not because glass was unavailable, though glass was expensive, not because the medieval builders did not understand how to make larger openings. Small windows were, in defensive contexts, specifically designed to be small. An arrow slit, the very narrow, tall opening in a castle wall, was sized to allow an archer inside to see and shoot outward while presenting the smallest possible target to anyone trying to shoot inward. The geometry of an arrow slit is careful. The exterior face of the wall has a very narrow vertical opening. The interior face has a much wider opening, splayed outward, allowing the archer to swing their bow across a considerable angle while only a thin vertical gap is visible from outside. A skilled medieval archer defending from behind an arrow slit could cover a wide arc of the exterior, while an attacking archer trying to shoot through the same slit was aiming at a target approximately 2 finger widths wide. This asymmetry, wide field of fire for the defender, tiny target for the attacker, was the entire point of the design. It was ballistic geometry, solved in stone by builders who understood the problem from practical experience. The placement of the kitchen. In medieval castles and large manor houses, the kitchen was not typically placed in the center of the building, near the Great Hall. It was placed at a remove, often in a separate building entirely, connected to the hall by a covered walkway, sometimes at the end of a long service passage. This seems inconvenient, and it was inconvenient. Carrying food from a kitchen separated from the hall by a walkway or passage meant the food cooled somewhat in transit. It meant more labor, more steps, more opportunity for things to go wrong, but fire. The kitchen contained the most concentrated and persistent fire in the entire castle. The bread ovens and cooking fires burned continuously for many hours in a confined space. They generated enormous heat. They produced sparks. They created the conditions most likely to produce a fire that could spread. By separating the kitchen from the main residential and ceremonial spaces of the castle, the medieval builders were isolating the greatest fire risk from the areas they most needed to protect. If the kitchen caught fire, and medieval kitchen fires were not uncommon, it could be dealt with or abandoned without the entire structure being at immediate risk. This was an architectural fire compartmentalization system, built in stone, designed to contain the worst-case scenario rather than eliminate it, because elimination was not possible. The same logic appears in modern building design, where fire compartmentalization, the use of fire-resistant walls and doors to limit the spread of fire through a building, is a fundamental principle of safety engineering. Medieval builders arrived at the same principle through observation and experience, not through engineering calculation. The moat. The moat seems obvious. Water around a castle prevents attackers from approaching the walls, but the moat served additional functions that are less immediately apparent. The presence of a water barrier required any attacker to use siege equipment to cross it. This slowed the attack, but it also made the preparation for crossing visible. Defenders on the castle walls could observe the construction of siege bridges and other crossing equipment and take countermeasures. The moat also prevented undermining. One of the most effective siege techniques in the medieval period was to dig a tunnel beneath the foundation of a castle wall, support the tunnel with wooden props, fill the tunnel with combustible material, and set it alight. When the props burned and collapsed, the tunnel collapsed, and the section of wall above it would crumble. A moat filled with water prevented this entirely. You cannot dig a stable tunnel beneath a body of water. The water seeps in, the tunnel floods, the technique fails. Castle builders who dug moats were not only creating a barrier to direct approach, they were neutralizing an entire category of siege technique, and the moat was also, in settled peacetime, a productive resource. Moat water supported fish farming. Many castle moats contained fish ponds that provided a reliable source of food for the household. The defensive water feature doubled as a larder. Medieval engineering rarely missed an opportunity to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The narrow streets of medieval towns were not accidental. They were not simply the result of haphazard building without planning. In a world without mechanical cooling, the narrow street provided shade. Tall buildings on either side of a narrow lane blocked direct sunlight for most of the day, keeping the street and the ground floors of the buildings cooler than they would have been in an open arrangement. In a world without running water, the narrow street collected runoff toward the central channel more efficiently than wider ones. The drainage, such as it was, worked better when the street's geometry funneled rather than dispersed, and in a defensive context, narrow streets were a tactical asset. An invader who entered a walled medieval town through a breach in the walls found himself in a warren of narrow, turning streets with no clear sight lines. Defenders who knew the streets could maneuver effectively. Attackers who did not were disoriented. The narrow street was simultaneously a climate response, a drainage system, and a defensive labyrinth, not by accident. By the accumulated decisions of builders and town planners who understood, from practical experience, what each of these qualities was worth. Medieval architecture was not the product of ignorance. It was the product of a specific kind of knowledge. Knowledge built from observation, from failure, from the lessons of buildings that burned, of walls that fell, of towns that flooded. Knowledge accumulated without the formal tools of modern engineering, but knowledge nonetheless. We have spent this evening with 4 areas of medieval rulemaking: the sumptuary laws, which maintained a visual language of legal status and a world that depended on visible identification; the rituals of the feast, which were an integrated safety system designed to protect those who had reason to fear what was in their food; the laws of curfew, bread, and franklage, which were practical responses to fire risk, food security, and the absence of a formal police capacity; and the logic built into stone, the clockwise staircase, the narrow window the isolated kitchen, the moat, the narrow street, each a solution to a specific problem embedded in the building itself so that it would function without any conscious effort from the people using it. The medieval world was not a primitive world. It was a world working with a different set of tools. Its rules were not arbitrary. They were calibrated, imperfectly, yes, but genuinely to the conditions that produced them. And when we look at those conditions honestly, the rules stop looking strange. They start looking like exactly what they were: people trying to solve problems, using everything they had. You do the same thing. Every day, in ways large and small, you devise solutions to the specific problems of your specific world. Most of those solutions will not outlast you. Some of them might become habits. A few, perhaps, will become customs that your children follow without quite knowing why. That is how the medieval world became embedded in us, not through grand historical events, but through the slow accumulation of practical solutions that worked and that survived. You are the result of a very long chain of problem solving, and tonight you do not need to solve anything. The problems of the day are done. The buildings around you were designed, in their own way, to keep you safe. The customs of daily life have done their invisible work. Let everything settle. Let your breath find its natural pace. The medieval builders are at rest. The food tasters and the sumptuary inspectors and the curfew bell ringers are all at rest. And now you rest too. The night is yours entirely.